attrition rates, look at the weakening of the Ukrainian army, look at the strengthening of the Russian day by day. The war is over. It's either this horrible deal for the Ukrainians now, or it's an even worse deal in the future. I don't want to pretend as if no security guarantees, no NATO, no nothing, no territories back. None of this is a good deal for Ukraine. It's a horrible deal. It's a humiliating peace, but it's the only option at the moment at the table. So I do think that Americans realized that they got defeated in Ukraine. I mean, Trump himself was happy to send javelins and escalate the conflict during his first administration. So I don't see any principled issue of not confronting great power. So I do think that this is a reasonable argument that the Americans simply, the war machine ran into the ground. They lost this one. So what do? The Europeans, they don't want to do any course correction. They just want to push on even after it's been lost, even though it will lead to an even worse peace.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today my guest is again my friend and colleague Dr. Glenn Disen, who's a professor at the University of Southeast Norway. We want to discuss today the tumultuous last week when we've seen several state visits in the US, first from France, Mr. Macron, then from Mr. Starmer of the UK, and finally the big shouting match between Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Trump on Friday, and the things that have happened since. Glenn, welcome back to the channel.
Thank you. It's good to be back with you.
I really want to listen to your take of things, and also in the context of your own videos that you did over the last couple of days and weeks, because you've had a lot of very important guests on your show. You're working with also with the Duran, and are you able to make sense of what all the diplomacy that we've just seen unfolding and collapsing in the last, let's say, 7 to 10 days?
Well, I think it's collapse of diplomacy is the right word, and I was making a comment on this as well. But besides the politics behind it, I think it's very dangerous. Attrition rates, look at the weakening of the Ukrainian army, look at the strengthening of the Russian day by day. The war is over. It's either this horrible deal for the Ukrainians now, or it's an even worse deal in the future. I don't want to pretend as if no security guarantees, no NATO, no nothing, no territories back. None of this is a good deal for Ukraine. It's a horrible deal. It's a humiliating peace, but it's the only option at the moment at the table. So I do think that Americans realized that they got defeated in Ukraine. I mean, Trump himself was happy to send javelins and escalate the conflict during his first administration. So I don't see any principled issue of not confronting great power. So I do think that this is a reasonable argument that the Americans simply, the war machine ran into the ground. They lost this one. So what do? The Europeans, they don't want to do any course correction. They just want to push on even after it's been lost, even though it will lead to an even worse peace.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today my guest is again my friend and colleague Dr. Glenn Disen, who's a professor at the University of Southeast Norway. We want to discuss today the tumultuous last week when we've seen several state visits in the US, first from France, Mr. Macron, then from Mr. Starmer of the UK, and finally the big shouting match between Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Trump on Friday, and the things that have happened since. Glenn, welcome back to the channel.
Thank you. It's good to be back with you.
I really want to listen to your take of things, and also in the context of your own videos that you did over the last couple of days and weeks, because you've had a lot of very important guests on your show. You're working with also with the Duran, and are you able to make sense of what all the diplomacy that we've just seen unfolding and collapsing in the last, let's say, 7 to 10 days?
Well, I think it's collapse of diplomacy is the right word, and I was making a comment on this as well. But besides the politics behind it, I think it's very dangerous how diplomacy itself has been falling apart, because we see that why would they have this quarrel in front of the cameras? And I made a point. It's important to note that you have two audiences. They're talking to each other, but there's also trying to pressure each other by reaching out to the public. So I would have assumed if the cameras weren't on them, that they wouldn't have put on this show. And I agree with Vance. I think that Zelensky, he wasn't behaving appropriately, but at the same time, the way they were approaching Zelensky as well, obviously they wouldn't have done this if it wasn't for the cameras. Now you can argue that they're defensive or offensive, but whatever it was, this is not usually done in front of cameras. But this is a new megaphone diplomacy. You just scream to the audience, see who can scream the loudest, and I think it's the role of narrative control. It's so important these days that it makes it very difficult to have diplomacy. And I know the Europeans are quite horrified. Oh my goodness, how can you do this in front of camera? This is inappropriate. But how are the Europeans any better? We're fighting a proxy war against Russia, the world's largest nuclear power. And again, for 3 years, nobody even wants to sit down with Russia. And the arguments we often get is, well, we don't want to legitimize Putin. We don't want to, so everything is about how you're portraying it. Like we have to portray it to the public that is isolated. We have to do this. So everything is about, sending a message, and you always have to make sure that the audience get the message they want. So it's very difficult to do diplomacy, and indeed the Europeans refuse diplomacy, despite the fact that all these hundreds of thousands of people are dying. They don't want to do diplomacy, and you see now with the Americans, they do want to do diplomacy, but both the Ukrainians now and the Americans got engaged in a shouting match. But it's I think it was predictable, not to this extent. I did not see this coming, but it was before they met. There was it was obvious that it wasn't simple to sign an agreement, because the agreement, that the document they had published, was so vague about the minerals. It obviously had been settled, and the issue of security guarantees is the front and center of what they were trying to link to this energy deal. So I think it. Yeah, the idea that they came there not to sign an agreement, but do last minute negotiation over what it actually means, and then do this in front of the camera, it was a recipe for disaster. So I don't know who managed this, but it was terrible to watch.
The way that Alexander Mercury also explains it a lot is that it was apparently the job, or he interprets it as having been the job of Mr. Macron on Monday and then Starmer on Thursday, to kind of extract these backstop concessions from Donald Trump, because that's apparently what the Europeans were after, and that the United States commits itself militarily to help the Europeans in case they got in trouble if they actually start sending troops into Ukraine, and that this is what failed, and that Mr. Zelensky still wanted to go back to this point, something that the Americans simply weren't willing. On the other hand, that deal, this mineral deal, or it was more than minerals, right? It's in general like the wealth of the Ukrainian state that was there being about to be signed away. That seemed to me such a horrible idea for Ukraine to do in the first place. I mean, I'm kind of glad Ukraine didn't sign that, because to me it would look as if though you give things away in perpetuity, 50% of your nation's wealth in perpetuity in the future. Do you think that this was this meant seriously? I mean, also Alexander Mercury also keeps saying that the mineral deal was originally the idea of Mr. Zelensky. That's true as well, but the Americans flipped it on its head and made it a repayment instead of a future promise of profits, instead of like taking the bribe. How do you read what these different actors actually try to do with each other?
Well, it is correct that it initially was Zelensky who approached the Americans with this proposal. Again, it's worth noting here, this is immensely horrible deal for the Ukrainians to hand over all of these resources, which they definitely need to actually recover the country afterwards. But But Ukraine is in a very desperate position, and if they don't end this war, the Ukrainian army, we're watching its collapse. The Russians will take huge territories. They will take most of these resources. Indeed, the Russians already have most of these resources. So if they don't do anything, then it will end up much in Russia's control. So the way Zelensky probably saw it is, let's promise it to the Americans if they're willing, well, more or less to fight for it. So the way I saw it was, the Ukrainians wanted this as a security guarantee, so effectively buying American military assistance against Russia. Um, but as Trump said, this is not what they want. They argue that if we merely help to extract these rare earth minerals, then that would be enough to deter the Russians because they wouldn't want to attack American interest and all of this. So it will be enough. And obviously, if, as Trump said, we hold all the cards there, and that's right. They have all the leverage, and that's why they found this push by Zelensky to be, yeah, inappropriate. But I don't think it was going to work ever because, as you said, the security guarantees, they are people treat it as something unproblematic. You give security guarantees now; they don't have to worry that much. But as I always make the point in any peace deal, you want to remove the incentives for restarting the conflict. Great, the security guarantees they can deter Russia, which is great. Then it's less likely that Russia will renew hostilities. But unlike the narrative we're being fed every day, this is not simply Russia, going after trying to conquer territories. There are more sides in this conflict. One of them is that NATO actually did start this war in 2014 by toppling the government and has sabotaged every meaningful peace agreement since in order to keep a long war to use Ukrainians to fight Russia. So it has to go both ways. And we know already that Zelensky is quite desperate to get the Americans in on his side. We know in the past he even lied, for example, about the Russian missiles hitting Poland in order to try to pull in NATO into this war. So what would happen if there's security guarantee? You would give so much incentives to Zelensky to break that and restart conflicts if he knows that he can bring the Americans in on his side to reconquer the territories which they had lost. So I think yeah, as Trump said, that he's playing with World War III. This is not what you want to do. And yeah, the deal I think was never going to really work. But I think Zelensky's idea was, you show up, you dismiss all talks about diplomacy, all talks about negotiations, and you buy into the idea that Russia is this terrorist state who just will never stop attacking, will always just want to kill out of joy, and it has to be stopped. And this is why they need security guarantees, and this is how we're building it into this rare earth deal. And I just want to say, finally, I very much agree with you. I think it's no coincidence that Macron and Starmer came in at the beginning. I think these are the two main countries in Europe which actually matters now, as their military powers. They also have some ability to disrupt anything that America wants to do in terms of negotiating a peace. And yeah, we saw both Macron and Starmer bring up the same thing. We need security guarantees from the United States because the Europeans can't send in what they call peacekeepers on the ground in Ukraine unless they have American backing, because Russia would destroy them all. They're not going to accept it. From Russia's perspective, they invaded Ukraine to prevent NATO incursion into Ukraine. So if you have, European peacekeepers, it's still the same NATO countries. It would be a stepping stone. They would never leave, and it would be a stepping stone to de facto NATO membership. So they're not going to accept this. They don't want them there. And I think the Americans know very well that they won't accept it. So why would the Americans? They can't accept this giving security guarantees. So this was the main conflict, I think, and this is when also Zelensky and Vance, went at each other when Zelensky kept rejecting the whole idea of having any diplomacy, that it wasn't possible, and shut down what Vance was trying to push forward. So they wanted Zelensky to agree, yes, okay, we'll make a peace. The war is over. We lost. Here's the demands. Get on board with Team America, and he didn't, and that's when things went very quickly south.
Do you also think that we, for the first time, now have a clash of narratives really on the top level? Because the narrative we've been hearing from the US and from Europe, based with maybe the exception of Hungary, and then maybe with the exception of Slovakia after Mr. Fico became president there, was that this is an unprovoked aggression, and the only way it can end is a just war, and a just war needs to be the Mr. Zelensky's peace formula, right? That has been for 3 years the narrative that we've heard, and Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance obviously do not do not buy that. They are actually much closer to what we've been discussing, the way that they understand the conflict. Although they're still, I mean, I'm yet waiting for some clear statements. I mean, for instance, something that Mr. Vance could have thrown at Mr. Zelensky is like, why did you not take the deal you had in April, right, in 2022? Why did you not take the Istanbul one? I mean, that would have been something he could have thrown at him, but he didn't. So some things are yet to be seen of how they view the origins of the conflict. But when it comes to what they want to achieve, it seems that their position and their analysis of the situation is much closer to ours than that of the past 3 years.
No, I agree, and I think narratives have become a huge part of politics, especially now great power politics, and the narratives which have been pushed so hard by NATO over the past years has always it always sounds caring and altruistic and principled, but as we see, the narratives always translate into a long war without exception. So you mentioned the idea that the war was unprovoked. I mean, this is just objectively false. This
One of the
was,
most provoked wars of the last
yeah,
50
no,
years.
and again, the people on the American side recognize it. We talked many times about the CIA director, of course, of the US also pointing out years ago that this would start a war if we try to do this. Anyways, but why unprovoked? Well, unprovoked is because if it was a war which is provoked, then we recognize that the Russians actually have some legitimate security concerns which have been ignored. We don't have to respect or acknowledge the legitimacy of how they responded in terms of an invasion, but if it was provoked, then there's at least two sides to the story, and then it's important to sit down and negotiate, and for the sake of peace, we can find a middle way. However, if you say that it's unprovoked, well, what does that entail? Well, it's just Russia acted in a vacuum. It's military opportunistic. It wanted to conquer territories. Now, suddenly, diplomacy and war looks very different. If you do diplomacy now, it's dangerous. It's emboldening him to take more territories in the future. Dictators around the world are watching this.
It's
And so
appeasement.
diplomacy is appeasement. And the only way you can have peace now is to defeat Russia on the battlefield. So the unprovoked narrative was very key because NATO, after sabotaging the peace negotiations in Istanbul in the beginning of 2022, they shut down all diplomacy. They said, we're not going to talk to Russia anymore. This will be settled on the battlefield. Weapons are the path to peace. If Russia's in the room at the OSCE meeting, the Europeans will stand up and leave the room. So now diplomacy is something immoral, which is also why the Hitler analogy is so overwhelmingly popular. Why do they always talk about Hitler? Why do we perpetually live in the 1930s? Well, because it's the same with Hitler. It's when you're facing evil, there can be no diplomacy, there can be no compromise, and peace happens by simply defeating the adversary. And that's what we're looking at. So I think all of these things we're saying to sound wonderful as, now after this war, Ukraine will get its NATO membership. It sounds like we're, very empathetic to Ukraine, but we're not. What we're telling the Russians is whatever territory you don't conquer, NATO will get that territory after the war. So the historical city of Odessa, strategically on the Black Sea coast, can be used to confront Russia. If you don't take it, we will take it. This is what we're telling the Russians. It's impossible to stop the war. What exactly can Russia do now? We told the Russians either you capitulate and NATO moves into Ukraine, or you'll fight this to the end, which entails killing hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. It's terrible, and So when people are shocked when they see, oh my goodness, the Americans, they voted with Russia at the UN, which was again historical. But the fact that what did they actually say? Well, they didn't want to blame everything on Russia. They didn't say, there were many sides in this conflict. Let's not put all the blame on the Russians. Why? Well, you can listen to our media suggest that he's, bought by the Kremlin as a secret agent, or if you say that one side is completely guilty, the other side is completely innocent, it's very difficult to find a compromise now. There's no anything you give to the opponent is now illegitimate. It's simply rewarding aggression. So I think people get caught up in these narratives, and it's good that someone's punching some holes in them because they're fake, a lot of them. But as we see in narratives, they often get immune to facts. So we can present any facts, and what do they say? Well, that's what the Russians are saying. So why are you repeating Russian narratives, not ours? You have picked the wrong side, and they always go after the person. I've seen this a million times. Whenever people come up, they present some facts which goes against the narrative, they always attack the person. Everyone's carrying water for Putin, or everyone is betraying the Ukrainians. And we have the slogans as well. It says, stand with Ukraine. We stand with Ukraine. What exactly does that mean? It means that we was going to continue the war, even though majority of Ukrainians want negotiations, even willing to surrender territory to get peace. It means we're going to not have diplomacy, continue this until even more people are dead and even more territory is lost. What is this standing with Ukraine? And when we stand with Ukraine, it also means we can't undermine the legitimacy of Zelensky. So when people are kidnapped across the country, men are grabbed off the streets, sent to the front lines to die, all these husbands and sons, which women are protesting against, we shouldn't report on it because it undermines it. When the churches are attacked, the Orthodox Church, we shouldn't say anything because, well, undermines Zelensky. When they purge the political opposition, the opposition media, we shouldn't say anything. So we're willing to do horrible things to the Ukrainians in the name of standing with Ukraine. So it's all narratives, it's all slogans. It's garbage. It's not reality. So I like the fact that Vance brought this up, this conscription or recruitment. But of course, some things were quite unseeming, like criticizing for not wearing a suit. I mean, this is for me, this is a bit over the top. There's no point to humiliate the man either. So there was some bullying there, I would admit, though.
Yeah, I would see it that way too, because on the one hand, I am n not at all a fan of Mr. Zelensky, but if you think about his position being in the White House in the Oval Office with cameras running and actually having to defend the Ukrainian position. I mean, whatever you think of the Ukrainian position, I mean, he's the man paid to do that, right? So I do understand a certain part of this, although like he clearly should have kept his cool. Um, but what I also wonder about is because this is happening all so publicly. Um, and as you said, like diplomacy usually works differently. So this is what are we witnessing? Is this maybe a smokescreen for something else? Because the the word in the in these circles also is that it is possible that actually the Americans and the Russians are negotiating on a different track as well, that nobody is being informed about. There's one theory out there that there's actually some old school um, embassy to government negotiations going on through actually secured channels between the Americans and the Russians in order to get closer to a bilateral understanding of what should happen. And we know from the Russians that for them it includes the a at least a common approach toward a security structure, not just Ukraine, but much, much more, right? Europe and global security structure as well. Do you believe that there is it's not track two, it's like that there's another track of diplomacy going on besides this smokes and mirrors that we might be seeing that's meant for public consumption, and that might also be meant to keep the Europeans busy, because now they are busy. They're so busy with themselves that I just wonder if there's any other agenda here.
No, I think I almost take it now for granted. Again, Trump himself said that this deal has to be done fast or it might not be done at all. And again, what he does with Starmer and Macron, he talks to them, he tries to make them leave, with a smile on their face, but they're not being given anything. So, when Hegseth said there will be no NATO expansion, Ukraine is not going to get all its territories back, and there will be no US security guarantees. They say this because they understand the Russian position. They understand also this is what is required for peace. Furthermore, they have been quite clear, at least for the Trump administration, saying that the war has been lost. Nothing can be reversed anymore. This can only escalate towards a nuclear war. It's pushing Russia further to China. There's nothing to be gained anymore. They genuinely want this war to end now. So. But how can they do this? Again, the Russians agree with this, the Americans agree, the Chinese, most of the world can get on board with this, except for the Europeans and Zelensky. And they say Zelensky because if there's a different leader like Arostovich or something, they could get a deal. But because the majority of Ukrainians want this, it's Zelensky. So what is the instrument they can use against Zelensky? If he doesn't fall in line, what would you do if you're the United States? You're doing this, working behind the scenes with the Russians, trying to come up with a bilateral deal, because here, to be honest, it's only the Americans and the Russians who matter. The Americans, they dominate over NATO. This is a NATO-Russia proxy war, and Russia has effectively won the war. So it is, this is the realism. It's the Americans and the Russians who will determine now the outcome. So they're trying to come together to a position, but they have to get the Americans, that Trump is, you have to get the Europeans and Zelensky on board. So what would you do? Well, they have a huge card over Zelensky. If he doesn't want to fall in line, they can question his legitimacy. And they've done this already. Trump forgot he forgot apparently that he called Zelensky a dictator. I don't buy that for a second. He forgot it. But and this is what Vance said as well. Like, you look what you've done to your own country. They're questioning his entire legitimacy. And also now Zelensky, when he goes back or gone back to Ukraine, who is he? He's the leader now who the Americans despise now. They don't like him. They don't want to. They question his legitimacy. So now suddenly he can very quickly be removed. Indeed, if you're in the Ukrainian military, do you think he's the best person to bring peace to your country when your main supporter over the past 3 years, the United States, obviously can't stand him? No. So I think this is the little concealed threat they have, that is, we will remove you. And it's the same with well, it's not the same, but with the French and the British, they, look how he offered, we can do a big trade deal with Britain. They're giving them some carrots, but they won't move. America won't move on the Ukrainian issue. So it's, I think they're trying to pacify the Europeans, threatening to remove Zelensky, and the Americans want to end this war now, and they will push it through. And you can, of course, see this debacle in the Oval Office through this lens.
And how it's just so incredibly difficult to know these days what means anything at all anymore, because on the one hand there have been Ukraine did sign all of these security agreements with various European states, right? And there was there was now for the longest time this stance of the Europeans, of Ukraine and the Europeans, that you cannot have presidential elections in Ukraine. It's impossible as long as the war is going on and martial law is there. It's impossible. And now, after what happened on Friday, all of a lot of European media are now discussing, maybe Mr. Zelensky needs to be exchanged, right? Maybe there needs to be somebody else. So it seems that now the idea is is in the room that maybe he can be changed after all, and maybe you don't even need a direct election for that. This is so bizarre coming from those people. So what do they actually believe in, that in these narrative constructs that they create, because they break their own rules that they make themselves constantly as they move forward?
Well, keep in mind that also the NATO Secretary General, after Pete Hegseth came out and said there will be no NATO expansion, this has to be the foundation of any deal. The UN the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte came out and he said, "Well, we never actually promised NATO membership as part of peace deal, but for Christ's sake, they've been saying, the bridge to NATO membership is strong, it's well lit, this is where we're moving, it's non-negotiable, all this nonsense, and now." Of course, reality kicks in and the narrative shifts. But this is also the power of Trump. I mean, for most people, all they see is a very loudmouth, arrogant, a bit of bullish behavior. But yeah, this is a huge weakness if you're in many ways in politics too. But it's also part of the power of Trump. He comes in, he creates a huge mess, he makes these bombastic statements, and he shakes it up. And by doing this, it creates this huge space for maneuver where previously nothing could be done. So he breaks narratives, and he forces others to break them as well. It's quite interesting to watch. I don't think it's good. It's not good for a politician because you want to be predictable. But at the same time, look what we've done in the West. We locked us into these crazy narratives that we can't talk to our opponents. War, weapons are the path to peace. Russia didn't have any legitimate security concerns. It was unprovoked. They want to restore the Soviet Union. I mean, even a 10-year-old should be shaking their head. This is just so stupid now. It doesn't make any sense at all. So when he comes, he's able to just plow through all of this. And, he can say facts which aren't real. He can make up like Zelensky has 4% approval. That's not correct. I mean, Zelensky couldn't win an election anymore if it was a free election, but 4% is not real. It can't be real, I think. So no, so he's making up, things as he goes along, and but he gets away with everything. But it's also, yeah, it's a weakness, but it's also works as an advantage
Yeah.
at times.
It's kind of sledgehammer approach, and
Yeah.
he has like de facto managed to completely create a new space for negotiation. No doubt about that. But the one thing that frustrates me so much with the Europeans is that again they don't they don't stick to their own logic. They don't stick to their own to the world that they create. I mean, again, the idea has been, Ukraine has the right to join NATO, and even if the US says no, we still stick with the Ukraine has the right to join NATO. No, that's not how NATO works. This is not how it works. You are the one who told us that NATO needs consensus, and not only do you disregard that also Hungary is a member and said no for a long time, you're telling us outright that Hungary has nothing. I mean, Hungary will follow along. But now you're also telling us that you will string the United States along when this is not how it's supposed to work, right? So what kind of stupidity is that then while also still risking to invite war onto all of Europe, right? The whole idea, the whole thing that the British and the French now want is the guarantees that if we send people in, then the Americans will come and bail us out. But that would still mean fighting in Europe. I mean, you are risking the national security of France and Britain for what? For Ukraine having the right to join NATO. Why would you risk that if NATO is
But
there to protect you from risk?
But this is also one of the silly narratives which they make up, and it sounds so again. It sounds moral and virtuous, like Russia shouldn't have any say what Ukraine does. It has its own foreign policy. It can join NATO if it wants to, and it sounds very reasonable. Again, it's Ukraine is an independent country. It should be allowed to choose its own foreign policy. If it's not allowed, it suggests that Russia still has some imperial control over Ukraine. So it sounds so sensible, but there's nothing sensible about this at all. That is, never before in history has anyone suggested that somehow the recipe for peace and stability is simply for a military bloc to expand up to another great power and ignore its security interest. I mean, Mexico has all the rights in the world in terms of politics, political rights, economic rights, but it doesn't have the right to host Russian and Chinese military bases. If it tries to do it, it would be pummeled like Ukraine is. And it's just not a statement of support, it's just reality. So what we have done in Europe after the Cold War was we said, well, what represents Europe? Well, NATO represents Europe. Everyone should be a part of NATO except for Russia, which now ends up in a situation, and Russia shouldn't have any veto rights over NATO. So now we're in a situation where the largest state in Europe is the only one who shouldn't have a say in Europe, and it's absurd. But if you strip away the institutional veto power Russia has, or voice it has over saying no, you can't, build up this military infrastructure and missiles on our borders. You can't do this. If we strip them off their institutional voice, then they're left with the military, and that's what we're seeing now. So it's just very strange. Everyone knew this was going to happen. I mean, Merkel once said that, trying to get Ukraine into NATO would be interpreted as a declaration of war by Moscow. And then later on we say, oh, no, it was unprovoked. I mean, you can't have it both ways, but we continue to go into this very strange narratives. But this is the problem, and I think this is also uniquely an issue for Europe. I wrote an article a few months ago about how Europe's new political class began rejecting reality. It's on my Substack, and I made this point that for the Europeans, how do you get all these countries to have a consensus and to have a common position? Because it's very strange. You don't have the same national interest, especially in a multipolar world where the interests diverge more. So what do? Well, you have to frame everything as right versus wrong. And you saw this already in the 90s. So going to expand NATO, should we expand the European Union? Well, everyone had to agree. EU is about democracy, freedom. It's a peace project. So if you're against it, then you hate democracy and peace pretty much. And it became impossible for people to oppose it. But there were real challenges with it, which was never addressed because we delegitimized dissent, the opposition, because it's very simple. It's good or bad. And we do the same, of course, with foreign policy. So what happens when there's actually dissent? People saying, well, this does make sense. You can't just expand a hostile military bloc up the Russian borders and expect, that they will simply capitulate. This will trigger war. Well, what do we do? Well, that's pro-Russian, we say, because that's illegitimate. In other words, Hungary comes along. They say, let's start to try to create a space for diplomacy between Ukraine and Russia. Well, you're a Putinist. Then Fico says the same. Well, you're a Putinist too. You have in Romania Georgescu, who wins also on a peace platform. Well, he's far right and also a bit of a Putinist. So now, we can annul the elections. We can see him be detained by the police. Trump as well, he wants to end this war, and he makes a clear case why, it can't be won anymore. If we don't have weapons, the Ukrainians don't have more manpower. If we're going to continue this, we have to escalate, which could lead to World War III. Well, what do we say? Oh, he might be bought by the Kremlin. Remember Russiagate, not the actual Russiagate, but the narrative. And we only use these stories to deprive any opposition of legitimacy. By the way, that goes for academics and journalists as well. Try to make a case for peace now in Europe and see what will happen to you. See the words they will attach to you. Will never discuss the merit of the argument. They will only go after the person. There's only one right position. That's why standing with Ukraine means, keep fighting to the last Ukrainian. It's absurd, but we paint ourselves into these corners, and this is where we are.
Last question, maybe. There is another very intelligent argument that was made by Brian Baletic that overall what the United States is doing at the moment is still in character. That actually there has been a long history of the US basically reversing course whenever it hits a wall with the Russians, but it never does so in order to truly change its policy, but to buy time to fight the Russians on another day. And he recalls the big reset under Obama in 2009, 2010, where Hillary Clinton and together with Mr. Lavrov literally pressed a reset button, and they were all smiles. And then the escalation still continued. So his interpretation is that Mr. Trump is just continuing this policy, and you could extend those arguments into the Cold War and say you've always had moments of détente, but détente was then again followed by militarization, as for example under Reagan, in order to put pressure on Russia. Do you also think that is the case, or do you see the current shift in policy under the Trump administration under a different light?
Are you an entrepreneur? Are you in a business now that you find yourself wearing all the hats?
World-renowned motivational speaker.
Les Brown.
Mr. Les Brown
is one of the most inspiring motivational teachers.
Well, a bit of both. I talked to Brian Berlitic about the same thing, and the real question is: are the Americans approaching the Russians now, proposing a permanent peace or like a temporary ceasefire? That is in the Cold War between the two of them, and I think it's a good argument that, well, again, what else is Trump going to do? We keep portraying this as simply him, handing over to Russia exactly what they want without getting anything back. But we lost the war. Look at the attrition rates. Look at the weakening of the Ukrainian army. Look at the strengthening of the Russian day by day. The war is over. It's either this horrible deal for the Ukrainians now, or it's an even worse deal in the future. I don't want to pretend as if no security guarantees, no NATO, no nothing, no territories back. None of this is a good deal for Ukraine. It's a horrible deal. It's a humiliating peace, but it's the only option at the moment at the table. So I do think that Americans realized that they got defeated in Ukraine. I mean, Trump himself was happy to send javelins and escalate the conflict during his first administration. So I don't see any principled issue of not confronting great power. So I do think that this is a reasonable argument that the Americans simply, the war machine ran into the ground. They lost this one. So what do you do? The Europeans, they don't want to do any course correction. They just want to push on even after it's been lost, even though it will lead to an even worse peace. So the Americans, I think they're more pragmatic, and and that's what you can see. They might be regrouping and go after the Russian a different day. Indeed, they're quite open about what they want. General Kellogg, I think, is interesting because he used to push very hard. Look, we're using the Ukrainians to kill Russians, and we're knocking out this great power rival from the ranks of great powers, and now we can focus on China. He said this is the acme of professionalism, and I actually put out a video where he said this, and he sent me a message on Twitter going, well, this is from Sun Tzu almost. So he was very happy about it. But anyways, he moves on, and now, of course, he's as part of the Trump team, and now he's saying, well, it's important to dislodge the Russians from the Iranians, from the Chinese, from the North Koreans. So let's, we pushed them together. They defeated us. Now we have to reach out to the Russians, try to split them a bit from the Chinese. Who knows? Maybe we can get the Russians on board to defeat the Chinese in the future. And if the Chinese are defeated again, then they can go after the Russians again. So I do think, yes, there's a part of this which is simply change course and do a temporary ceasefire before we have another go at the Russians. On the other hand, Ukraine was really our last opportunity to defeat Russia, to break them. I mean, this is a huge country we were able to. Well, the Americans were able to get control over after 2014. They took control over, a lot of the parts of the Ukrainian government, the intelligence services. They've been running it as a colony, according to, the former general prosecutor Viktor Shokin. And I don't think we're going to have this opportunity again. You're not going to be able to use, Georgia or Moldova as a proxy. We might try to, again, topple the government in Belarus, create some more problems. But Ukraine was really the big instrument, the big sledgehammer we could use against Russia. And if this is lost, we might have a problem. So I do think that it's, on one hand, it could be a temporary ceasefire. On the other hand, I think they do recognize the world has shifted dramatically. That is, the distribution of power. It's not a bipolar during the Cold War. It's not a unipolar after the Cold War. We now have China becoming, or has already become, the largest, most powerful economy. The Americans can't properly compete anymore. So if this is the largest power, you have to rethink the entire relationship in Europe. It made sense to have Russia as the boogeyman if this is the main opponent in a Eurocentric world. But it might be the Americans are simply adjusting to a new international distribution of power. So again, it's I could be wrong, but it's no, but I'm not sure if it's simply the same as back in 2011 with another. Was it 11, the reset?
10, 9, 9 and 10 when they.
Oh, 9, 10, yeah, sorry, yeah.
The-
Oh, I thought, yeah.
So in a sense, your interpretation is that the Americans are just much better students of Machiavelli. They just know that you don't keep betting on a losing horse, and sunk costs are sunk costs. You recover what you can, but you don't do it out of a feeling of like, oh, let's have eternal peace with the Russian and all sing kumbaya. It's just a cold calculation.
No, I think they're being very pragmatic, and then of course many people would see this as being immoral. I think it's I don't think necessarily it is. I think again, realist tradition, I think politicians have become too obsessed with good versus bad that they end up in these moral crusades. They end up again, if you're pushing for something which you can't achieve, like bringing Ukraine into NATO, this is why people like Professor Mersheimer pointed out since back in 2014, if you're trying to do this, you're only going to ensure their destruction. So the people are saying, no, but to have a moral case, why do we have to pull them into NATO? Otherwise, we're giving Russia authority. Okay, well, it's not going to be achievable. The Russians will destroy the country if you try to do this. And, he was proven to be right, but still the people who come with the moral claims, they still push back going, yeah, but we had morality on our side. We might not have been right. And if you're not right, it's not moral anymore because now your policies lead to horrible destruction. And I think this is also a point by Walter Lippmann. He made the argument that when you frame, propaganda, when you frame everything as being good versus evil, it's wonderful if you want to mobilize the public for war. Because if you can fight, the war to end all wars, make the world free safe for democracies, all of this stuff, defeat another Hitler, then people are all on board for another war. But if it was time to make peace, it's very dangerous, and that's why the Europeans have got themselves stuck. They can't. They kept telling themselves Russia wants to restore the Soviet Union, they're Hitler, all this nonsense. And now, how can you have diplomacy with Hitler? How can you? Stand by and let them create, if they're going to attack Poland and all this ridiculous stuff. So they lock themselves in, so they can't make peace anymore.
The path to hell is plastered with good intentions, and the path to Ukraine is plastered with not plastered. What's the word I'm looking for?
Paved.
Paved.
Yeah.
The
Was
path
that
to
Napoleon?
hell.
I can't remember.
The path
No.
to hell is paved with good intentions, and the path to Ukraine is paved with sweet promises of just peace and eternal bliss in NATO. Glenn, thank you very much for the update. I think this was very valuable. People should go and read you on your Substack and on your YouTube channel, correct?
Yes. I'm mainly on Substack and YouTube these days. Also have a Twitter, but Substack is it's a great platform, actually. Not to do too much promoting for them here, but you can do your articles, you can put the videos. So it's
and
Glenn
long
Disen
form
at
too.
Substack.
Long form too, which Glenn regularly does. Subscribe to him on Substack. He always pushes out very, very good information. Glenn Disen, thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Pascal.